Good evening, students. My recording of the Chapter 12 homework was interrupted, so I'm going to have to start over here. So you may notice that some of these questions are worked already, but that's okay. We're going to go through it again. So for his statistics class, Jay Gilbert decided to study how parents' income affects children's performance on standardized tests like SAT. He proposed to collect information from a random sample of test takers and examine the relationship between parental income and SAT score. Is this an experiment? If not, what kind of study is it? All right, well, all we're doing here is we're not administering a treatment. There's no random selection and assignment to control and treatment groups, things like that. It's not an experiment. I'm sorry, this is not an experiment. There are no manipulated factors. This is an observational study. In this case, we're collecting information from a random sample of test takers and examine the relationship between parental income and SAT. So an observational study can be either retrospective or prospective. This one is not either. Is there a relationship between parental income and SAT score? Why can't we conclude that differences in score are caused by differences in parental income? Well, even if the two have similar outcomes, it could be that something else is influencing the two. So we would say there may be lurking variables that are associated with both parental income and performance on the SAT. Okay, so let's do some. In countries known to contain lower levels of vitamin D, there were more reported cases of a particular type of rare disease. Some researchers hypothesized that a deficiency in vitamin D would increase the risk of developing the disease. These researchers compared vitamin D levels in blood samples from 140 missionaries who have developed the disease with blood samples of nearly 350 who have not. The samples were taken on average 5 years before the disease was diagnosed. Okay, this is an observational study, right? Let's see. Compared vitamin D levels in blood samples from 140 missionaries who have developed the disease with blood samples of nearly 350 who had not. The samples were taken on average 5 years before the disease was diagnosed. Okay. Okay, so we need to say whether it's retrospective or prospective. Sorry about that. So in this case, we're comparing the vitamin D levels in blood samples of people who have developed the disease. So this is retrospective. Okay. Is that an appropriate choice for investigating this problem? Yes, because the disease in study is a rare disease. A retrospective study is appropriate. Who were the subjects? The subjects were all the people who developed the disease, the researchers, the missionaries. What are we doing? We're comparing the blood sample from 140 missionaries. So it's the missionaries that we're studying. What were the variables? The level of vitamin D for the subject, the number of subjects who developed the disease, and whether or not the subject developed the disease, right? The vitamin D level, right? And whether or not that person developed the disease. Okay, let's put this here. All right. An experiment tested the ability of maggots to remove dead tissue from open wounds that would not heal on their own. Sterile maggots were placed in a small pouch, which in turn was placed on the wound. 100 women with wounds on their lower limbs were randomly assigned to receive either traditional surgical treatment or maggot therapy. After 8 days, the percentage of dead tissue in the wounds that underwent maggot treatment was 53.2% compared to 67.1% with the surgical treatment. Neither patients nor the doctors evaluating the wounds knew which therapy had been applied. Okay. Surprisingly, the number of patients that reported a crawling sensation was about the same in both groups. What kind of study is this? This is double-blind, since neither the patients nor the doctor evaluating knew which therapy had been applied. And people were randomly assigned to receive treatment, so it is also randomized. Is this an appropriate choice? Yes, such an experiment is an appropriate way to determine whether maggots were effective as surgery. Who were the subjects? The 100 women with wounds on their lower limbs. Identify the treatment and response variables. So our treatments were the maggots and the traditional surgical procedure. What was the response variable? The percentage of dead tissue. What we're measuring at the end is the percentage of dead tissue that in the wounds. Over a 4-month period, among 20 people with a circulatory disorder, patients who were given a high dose of a certain dietary supplement improved more than those given a placebo. The researchers kept track of and were aware of the dosage of the supplement and placebo. Okay. Identify whether the research above is an observational study or an experiment. 20 people were given a high dose or dietary supplement or a placebo. Well, the use of a placebo would be an experiment, but they didn't specifically say that they were randomly assigned and so on. So they should have given more information there to indicate that it's a well-designed experiment, right? Identify the subjects. These are the 20 people with circulatory disorder. Identify the factors. The high dose of a dietary supplement and the placebo are two different oh, I'm sorry. It's one factor, whether they were given the drug. And there are 2 levels of it, given the drug or even given the procedure. There's only one thing we're measuring, whether or not they have the placebo or the supplement, with those being the 2 levels. In the table below, name the factors. The dietary supplement has 2 levels to it. Either the placebo or the high dosage. The experiment used how many treatments? 2, right? We had the 2 conditions. Identify the response variable. Improved more in their circulatory disorder. So just improvement. Identify the design, completely randomized, blocked, or matched. This is unspecified, right? They didn't actually say. Let me check the other. Randomized, block, randomized, matched. Nope, it's unspecified. They did not say that they randomly assigned people or whatever they did. So we don't know. Identify whether the experiment was blind or double blind. Again, oh no, the researchers kept track of and were aware of the dosages of the supplements and the placebo. So this would have to be single blind. It would have to be that the people taking it didn't know, right? But the researchers certainly knew because they kept track of it. So it's not double blind. Identify the nature and scope of the conclusions regarding what the results of the experiment may or may not indicate. The experiment needs to be replicated and include double blinding, but it can determine whether or not the dietary supplement causes improvements in patients with circulatory disease. Okay, the experiment has determined that the dietary supplement causes improvement. The experiment design needs to include replication and double blinding. As it is, the experiment cannot determine whether or not the dietary supplement causes improvement in patients with circulatory disorder, at least over the short term. So our experiment determined that the dietary supplement causes improvements in patients with circulatory disorder. This is a better answer because we should have the double blinding in there and replication. Okay. There's some concern that if women over age 57 who take supplemental hormones also drink alcohol, their hormone levels will rise too high. 19 volunteers on hormone therapy were randomly divided into 2 groups, as were 20 other volunteers not on hormone therapy. In each case, one group drank an alcoholic beverage, the other a non-alcoholic beverage. An hour later, everyone's hormone level was checked. Only those on supplemental hormones who drank alcohol showed a marked increase. Identify whether the above research is observational or experimental. They're volunteers divided into 2 groups. Okay. And these were 20 other volunteers. Okay, so this is an experiment because we have 2 different levels here. We have an intervention that we are checking. It's just not necessarily a well-defined experiment, as we'll see, because we didn't really do random assignment and so on. So identify the subjects studied. So these would be the 19 volunteers and the 20 other volunteers. So 39 women over age 57. Identify the factors in the experiment and the number of levels for each. It's one factor, whether or not they drink alcohol. And there are 2 levels, whether or not they drink alcohol. Oh, I see. I'm sorry. I lied. I didn't read the question. 19 volunteers on hormone therapy were randomly divided into 2 groups, as were 20 other volunteers not on hormone therapy. So the hormone therapy is our factor, and it's whether or not they were on hormone therapy that are our levels. Oh my goodness, I am so sorry. Okay, well, let me try reading. In each case, one group drank an alcoholic beverage, the other a non-alcoholic beverage. Okay, so it's the type of drink that we are changing up on them. I apologize. So our two groups, whether or not they were taking hormones, define the people, but whether I thought they were both groups drinking alcoholic beverage. I'm sorry. So one group drank alcoholic beverage, what? And the other a non-alcoholic beverage, because we were dividing each of them into two groups. Gotcha. All right, so all right, now how many treatments did we have? So there would be 4 treatments: hormone therapy and alcoholic beverage, hormone therapy and non-alcoholic beverage, no hormone therapy and alcoholic beverage, no hormone therapy and non-alcoholic beverage. Okay, so our 2 treatments then are whether or not they had the hormone therapy. So there are a total of 4 conditions, but only the 2 treatments, taking the hormone therapy or not taking the hormone therapy. Got the 2 variables: what type of drink they received, alcoholic or non-alcoholic. The response variable is the hormone level. So here, this experiment is not completely randomized. It doesn't actually say it's randomized at all. But this would be matched because we have people who are on hormone therapy and people who are not on hormone therapy undergoing the exact same treatments. They're going to say randomized block, but it is not randomized. It is blocked. It's blocked by those 2 factors, whether they're on hormone therapy or whether they're not on hormone therapy. But it's not randomized. Identify whether the experiment was blind or double blind. They know whether they're taking the hormone therapy or not. They probably know whether they're consuming an alcoholic beverage or not. So I guess the closest answer is it's not known, but it wouldn't be possible to do any blinding there. Okay. Identify the nature and scope of the conclusions regarding what the results of the experiment may or may not indicate. This experiment indicates that taking hormone supplements leads to increased hormone levels among those drinking alcohol. The experiment indicates that women over 57 who take hormone supplements should not drink alcohol. I think that's a little bit more correct because we're restricting to just the age group that was studied. This is the only thing I have a problem with right here because it shows a market increase, but we don't really know if that's necessary to warn people off of it. I mean, there's not really enough information about what that increase does, but I think that that's okay. So then it should be just simply hormone levels among those drinking alcohol. So that taking hormone supplements leads to increase hormone levels among those drinking alcohol. Isn't that saying the same thing? Hold on. Oh, taking hormone supplements leads to increased, no, drinking alcohol leads to increased hormone levels among those taking hormone supplements. Okay, so we should have answered A there. We should have answered A. In 1984, a popular science magazine reported that a study of women in Poland indicated that having sons shortened the lifespans of mothers by about 35 weeks per son, but that daughters helped to lengthen their mothers' lives. The data came from church records from the period 1667 to 1777. Okay. So this would be an observational study because we're just looking at data. We're not manipulating anything or changing anything. This would be a retrospective study because we're looking back in time. It is not looking forward to the future, which would be a prospective study. The subjects were women in Poland. And these subjects were selected from church records. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see this one up here. Selection process is unknown. All right, I guess that's the closest because we have the church records. We don't know that they were randomly selected, but we know they came from church records, but we don't know what process used to select those church records. The parameter of interest is the average lifespan of mothers in Poland between mothers of sons and mothers of daughters. The nature and scope of the conclusion regarding what results may or may not indicate. For this group, having children was associated with a decrease in lifespan. Without random assignment, there was no way to know that having sons caused a decrease in lifespan. Let me see if I can find the difference between these two. Oh, no, yeah. This one is specifying it correctly with the son and the daughters. I didn't read this one at the top well enough. All right. And this is one of the problems with doing homework late at night. Ladies and gentlemen, we don't read carefully and always pay attention. A pet supply company wants to compare a low-calorie food with their standard turtle food. Oh, turtles. Turtles are fun. Okay. See if it is effective in helping inactive turtles maintain a healthy weight. I didn't know turtles came with weight problems. All right. The turtles have been classified as small, medium, or large. Company will supply some of the owners of each side with one or two foods. Okay. The treatments are a lower calorie food and the standard turtle food. So we've got two types of. Our experimental units are the tatas. The response variables, how big our turtle got. Do we have a fat turtle? Describe a method of assigning treatments if this is to be a randomized block design with the size of the breed as the blocking variable. Okay, so we divide them up into small, medium, and large. And then we would randomly select for within. That sounds pretty good. Let me read the others. No. I don't want to assign a number to the size category. I want to assign a number to the turtle within the category. We're not ranking turtles by weight. We're not listing turtles. How can you list turtles in alphabetical order? They all start with T. They're turtles. All right. Is blinding important in this experiment? I'm going to take my turtle for a walk more often if he's getting a low-calorie food. Blinding is not required because neither the owners nor the people checking the weights of each turtle at the end of the experiment can affect the results. Can I treat my turtle any differently? I mean, I suppose I can put my turtle on a leash and take him for a walk. Maybe it is that. So if I know he's on diet food, I'm going to put the turtle on the leash and take him for a walk. I should not do homework late at night. Okay, where are we? How can blinding be conducted? The researchers would know which turtle received which treatment. The owners would not because they might take their turtle on a leash or walk. Oh, I'm sorry. I can just see all these turtles on treadmills. Okay. The people checking the weights of the turtles would not know which turtle received which treatment. Wait, what did we miss? Oh, yeah, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether the people checking the weights know the which turtle received the treatment. That doesn't matter. Okay. All right. Why were the subjects randomly assigned to the, An experiment showed that subjects fed the DASH diet. That's to relieve hypertension. This is a real thing. The DASH, I forget what that stands for. Something, and then I think the last one's something or other. Okay, so the DASH diet is used to treat, hypertension, high blood pressure. Were able to lower their blood pressure by an average of 5.6 pounds compared to a group fed a control diet. All meals were prepared by dietitians. Why were the subjects randomly assigned to the diets instead of letting people pick what they wanted to eat? Self-selection could result in groups that were very different at the start of the experiment, make it impossible to attribute any differences in the results to their diet. Okay. Why were the meals prepared by dietitians? Okay, this helped to assure that the diets were followed and all subjects in each group received comparable treatments. Why did the researchers need the control group? A control group is needed so researchers can compare the change in blood pressure observed in the DASH diet group with the control group. If the DASH diet group's blood pressure was lower at the end of the experiment, wouldn't that prove the effectiveness of that diet? Yes, if the diet group's blood pressure was lower at the end, it would prove the effectiveness of that diet. I thought it was a control group. Oh, okay. We don't have people eating anything what they want. They're still being fed by the dietitian. So this doesn't have a true control group. Like a control group would need to be able to eat whatever they wanted. I didn't think about that. What additional information would you want to know in order to decide whether an average reduction in blood pressure of 5.6 pounds was statistically significant? We need to know the size of the standard deviation, because if we're looking at an average reduction in blood pressure of 5.6 pounds, we need to know if that's unusual compared to like the mean, which, you know, in order to do a Z-score formula, we have to have the standard deviation for that. A water dowser claims to be able to sense the presence of water using a forked stick. Suppose we wish to set up an experiment to test our ability. We get 30 identical containers, fill half with water, and ask the dowser to tell us which ones are full and which are empty. How will we randomize this procedure? We get 30 identical containers, fill half with water, and ask the dowsers to tell which ones are full and which are empty. Arrange the 30 containers in 30 separate locations and use a random number generator. So here we're just randomly picking where they are. Okay, that's good. The dowser correctly identifies the contents as 17 out of 30. 15 out of 30 is half, right? 17 just seems a little bit up from 30, so it's probably not significant. How many correct identifications out of 30 would the dowser have to make to convince you using statistics that the forked stick tricks works? Assume that statistical significance would mean a success rate of 90% or higher. So they would need to do 90% out of 30 identifications. That would be 20.9 times 30 is 27 identifications. A fake treatment that looks just like a treatment being tested is called a placebo. All right, guys, we are done with this homework. We'll do the chapter 20 homework, the 22 homework coming up.